Hey everyone, welcome back to the Deep Dive. We've been getting a ton of requests lately all about how to nail those first few months in a new leadership role. Like how to hit the ground running and make a real impact right out of the gate. So that's exactly what we're diving into today. And our guide for this is a true business classic, The First 90 Days by Michael D. Watkins. This book, it's been around for a while, but it's still so relevant. It's sold like almost 800,000 copies in English alone, and it's been translated into a whopping 27 languages.
Yeah, it's kind of a big deal, and for good reason. This deep dive, our goal is to really break down some of Watkins' core principles and give you guys some really practical insights that you can actually use to make your next career transition a total success.
And we're not just talking about feeling a little lost for a few weeks, right?
Yeah.
Like, the book cites some research that shows almost 90% of senior HR leaders agree that these transitions are hands down the most challenging times in a professional's life. And the really interesting thing is that how well you handle that initial period actually strongly predicts your overall success in the role.
That's a huge point. A rocky start, well, it might not be a career killer, but it definitely makes things a lot harder for you down the line. But get it right. And you're not just setting yourself up for success. A good transition can be a real catalyst for positive change in the entire organization.
Right, because you're coming in fresh, you don't have those established relationships or a deep understanding of the inner workings yet.
Yeah.
And you're under the microscope, right? Those first impressions, man, they form fast and they can be really hard to shake. Building that early credibility and getting a few wins under your belt can create some serious momentum, but if you stumble out of the gate, it's an uphill battle all the way.
Yeah, absolutely. And Watkins, he lays out these common traps that leaders can fall into, even really experienced ones. Things like clinging to what you're comfortable with, trying to force big changes before you really get the lay of the land, forgetting about building relationships with your peers, those horizontal connections, and not really taking the time to understand and adapt to the new culture. I'm curious, have you ever run into any of those in your own transitions? Or maybe you see some potential pitfalls in your current role or one that's coming up. All right, let's jump into the first fundamental principle Watkins outlines, and this one is all about accelerating your learning.
And I love how he emphasizes both speed and focus here. It's not just about soaking up information. It's about quickly gaining a deep understanding of all the moving parts. Not just the obvious stuff like their markets, products, tech, systems, but also those more subtle things like the company culture and the internal politics.
Oh, absolutely. It can feel overwhelming at first, right? Like you're drinking from a fire hose. And that's why a structured, focused approach is so important. You got to be really intentional about what you learn and how you go about learning it.
And this is where he talks about the action imperative, right? That urge to jump in, start doing things, proving yourself right away. But Watkins is really clear that acting without a solid foundation of knowledge is a risky move.
So true. There's this temptation to show everyone you're in charge, but, he actually uses this great example of a guy named Chris Hadley at Phoenix Systems. Hadley came in, made all these changes without really taking the time to understand the team's history or their challenges.
Oh, yeah, I remember that one. Didn't go so well for him, did it?
Not at all. It alienated his team and ultimately led to some really poor decisions that just made things worse. It's like this vicious cycle. Lack of information leads to bad choices, which just digs you deeper into that hole.
Ouch. So how do you avoid that? How do you learn effectively when everything's moving so fast?
Watkins suggests framing your learning around what he calls guiding questions. And he breaks these down into 3 categories: the past, the present, and the future. To understand the past, he suggests asking questions like, why have things always been done this way? Or what were some past attempts at change? Did they succeed or fail, and why? Getting a handle on that historical context is really key.
And then for the present, it's all about understanding the current reality. Things like, what's the real strategy here? What are people actually doing? Not just what's written in some fancy document. Or who are the real power players? The ones who might not have the fanciest titles but actually get things done. These are the questions that help you map out those existing dynamics.
And then looking ahead to the future, he suggests asking, what are the biggest challenges this organization is going to face down the road? Or what new skills are going to be absolutely essential for success moving forward? This gets you thinking proactively and helps you anticipate what's coming.
And he stresses that your learning needs to cover both the hard data reports, plans, all that, but also those softer aspects, like the culture and the internal politics. He even gives specific tips on where you can find these different types of insights.
Right. He talks about looking beyond the company walls, tapping into external sources like your customers. What do they really think about your organization? How do they see you compared to your competitors? Even your suppliers can provide a unique perspective. They see how your internal systems and processes actually work. Same with your distributors. They deal with the logistics and customer service side of things. And then there's always outside analysts who can give you that more objective bird's eye view of your company's position in the market.
And inside the organization, he says, the folks on the front lines in R&D operations, those are the people who are often closest to the core processes. They understand those external relationships at a very practical level. And then there's sales and procurement. They're the ones who are usually on the front lines of emerging market trends. You need to tap into all these different perspectives to get a complete picture.
But Watkins cautions against just, wandering around having random conversations. He says that can be really inefficient. Plus, you risk being swayed by the first few people you talk to or by folks who are, trying to push their own agenda.
So beyond just talking to people, what are some more structured ways to accelerate your learning?
One really powerful tool he suggests is what he calls the horizontal slice. Basically, you meet individually with each of your direct reports and ask them the exact same 5 questions. It goes like this. What are the biggest challenges facing the organization right now? Why do you think those challenges are happening? What opportunities are we missing out on? What's working really well that we should build on? And finally, if you were in my shoes, what would you prioritize?
Wow, that last one's a doozy, isn't it? It really forces them to think strategically, and you get so much insight into their own perspectives and priorities.
Right. And Watkins points out that how people answer these questions can be just as revealing as what they actually say, who's direct, who's hesitant, who takes ownership. All of that tells you a lot about the team dynamics and the underlying politics.
It's like reading between the lines, right?
Totally. And after those individual meetings, he recommends bringing your direct reports together as a group and sharing your initial observations. This not only fosters more open discussion, but also shows your team that you're really engaged in getting up to speed quickly.
I like how he talks about using frameworks like a SWOT analysis.
Yeah.
Strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, threats, not just to diagnose the situation, but also to communicate your findings to key stakeholders. It gives you a common language and a clear structure for those early conversations.
Absolutely. And he provides this really useful learning plan template to help you pull everything together. It lays out what you should be focusing on even before you start the new role, like developing your research strategy, figuring out what reports you need to review, planning conversations with your predecessor, if there is one, your new boss, and formulating those initial guiding questions we talked about.
Then once you're in the role, the template guides you through things like reviewing all that detailed data, conducting those one-on-one meetings with your team, really assessing those critical interfaces between departments, and then testing that strategic alignment, both from the top down and from the bottom up.
And the key thing to remember about learning is that it's not a one-and-done thing. You've got to be constantly revisiting your learning agenda, adjusting your focus, refining your questions as you gain more insights. All right, let's move on to the second key principle in the book, which is all about matching your strategy to the situation.
This one really resonated with me. There's no one-size-fits-all approach to leadership, especially during transitions. And he uses that great example of Carl Lewin at Global Foods, right? Where his strategy worked brilliantly in Europe, but totally flopped in North America.
Oh, yeah, Lewin's experience at Global Foods. It's a perfect illustration of how different situations demand different approaches. His decisive turnaround strategy in Europe, centralizing operations, making those tough calls to close some plants, that just wouldn't have flown in North America, where the real issue was more about complacency and lack of urgency.
It shows you how important it is to really diagnose the specific challenges and the unique context of the situation you're walking into.
And that's where Watkins introduces the STARS framework, which is incredibly helpful for understanding those different situations. STAR stands for startup, turnaround, accelerated growth, realignment, and sustaining success. And each one represents a different type of leadership challenge with its own unique set of characteristics.
It's so useful. So can we break down each of those STARS situations? Like what defines each one and what are some of the typical challenges and opportunities you might face?
Sure. Let's start with startup, where you're basically building something from scratch. It's all about gathering the right people, securing funding, developing your core technologies, and then creating the strategy and the basic structure of the organization. The big challenge here is often putting that initial team together, especially when resources are limited and there are a ton of unknowns. But the flip side is that you have this incredible opportunity to build things the right way from the very beginning, create a strong culture, and there's this energy that comes with a new venture. You don't have the baggage of old ideas or ingrained habits to deal with.
Then there's turnaround, which is a whole different ballgame. It's about rescuing something that's failing.
Yeah, this one's high pressure. You're often dealing with demoralized employees, major financial issues, and a real sense of urgency. Turnarounds require making tough decisions fast, and that often means making cuts, which is never easy. But the good news is that in a turnaround, everyone usually knows that change is needed. Even small wins early on can create huge momentum and generate outside support. So it's a tough situation, but there's potential for big impact, even with those difficult decisions.
And then how about accelerated growth? What are the key things to consider there?
Well, the focus in accelerated growth is managing that rapid expansion. It's about building scalable systems and structures that can handle that increase in volume and complexity. And integrating tons of new people into the existing culture, that can be a real challenge. But the upside is that the potential for growth is usually a huge motivator for people. They're often more open to new ideas and willing to push themselves.
Realignment, that seems like a tricky one. You're trying to revitalize an organization that's had success in the past but has maybe become stagnant or is facing new headwinds.
It is tricky. The biggest hurdle in a realignment is often convincing people that change is even needed. They've seen success before, so they may be resistant to rocking the boat. You might have to do some restructuring to adapt to the new realities of the market. But the good news is that there are usually pockets of real strength within the organization, a lot of expertise, and people who genuinely want to see the organization succeed again.
And lastly, there's sustaining success, which is about keeping that winning streak going, right?
Right.
Maintaining that competitive edge and taking a high-performing organization to that next level.
Right. It's about navigating the legacy of previous leaders, constantly pushing innovation to stay ahead of the curve, and what Watkins calls playing good defense against new threats. You've usually got a strong team in place, motivated by past success, and a solid foundation to build upon, like a strong product pipeline.
Oh, yeah.
But it's still a challenge to maintain that momentum and avoid complacency.
And a lot of leaders probably find themselves juggling several of these situations at once, right? Like different parts of the organization might be in different phases.
Yeah, that's super common. You might have a mature product line that's in a sustaining success mode, while simultaneously launching a brand new initiative that's very much a startup. Recognizing that you might have this portfolio of different situations and adjusting your approach accordingly is essential for being effective.
And the start situation you're in directly impacts your learning priorities when you first come in, doesn't it?
For sure. For example, in a turnaround, you need to get up to speed on the technical stuff really fast, like the ins and outs of the strategy, the markets, the technology. But if you're walking into a realignment where you're dealing with more ingrained behaviors and potential resistance to change, understanding the culture and the internal politics becomes way more important early on.
And STARS also impacts how you define your strategic intent and set your initial priorities.
Absolutely. In a turnaround, you might have to make some bold moves early on, like cutting loose some non-core businesses or implementing changes really quickly to stabilize the ship. But with a realignment, you might take a more measured approach, focusing on building consensus and making more deliberate changes over time. Even how you build your team, the kind of early wins you target, how you create alliances, all of that will look different depending on whether it's a turnaround versus a realignment, for example. In a turnaround, you might need to bring in some outside talent, shake things up a bit. But in a realignment, it might be better to promote high potential people from within who already understand the culture and the history.
And your own leadership style has to adapt too, right? I mean, that really decisive, maybe even a bit directive style that works well in a crisis might not be the best approach in a situation where you need to empower a team that's already high performing.
Exactly. Turnarounds often call for more of a heroic leadership style decisive action, a clear vision. But realignments might require more of a steward approach, where you focus on building consensus and understanding the existing strengths.
It's also interesting how performance evaluation and what defines success can vary so much across these different situations.
Oh yeah, in startups and turnarounds, it's often easier to measure success, right? You have clear metrics, tangible outcomes. But in realignments, and especially in sustaining success scenarios, it's trickier. It becomes more about, compared to what? It requires a much deeper understanding of the nuances of the situation. All right, let's move on to the third principle Watkins covers, which is all about securing early wins.
This one's all about creating that positive momentum and showing everyone that you can deliver.
Right, those early wins are crucial for building your credibility and showing that things are moving in the right direction. Watkins talks about not only establishing your own credibility in those early weeks, but also delivering tangible business value within those first 90 days.
It's about getting to that break-even point faster, where you're adding more value than you're consuming.
Exactly. And he really stresses having that open conversation with your new boss early on to negotiate some time for diagnosis and planning. It's so important to avoid getting sucked into just putting out fires before you've had a chance to understand the big picture and figure out your priorities.
Carve out that time to assess the situation, develop a real plan. And even if your boss's priorities aren't exactly the same as yours initially, it's usually a good idea to focus your early efforts on things that are important to them.
Oh, absolutely. It builds that relationship and helps you secure the support and resources you'll need later on. And it's not just about what you achieve, but how you achieve it, right? Getting those early wins in a way that aligns with the culture and the values of the organization is key for building that long-term credibility. You don't want to score a win that actually undermines you in the long run.
And what constitutes a win can be different depending on the star's situation.
For sure. Like in a realignment where there's resistance to change, just getting people to openly discuss the challenges might be a huge win. But in a turnaround, you're going to need more decisive actions, more tangible results. And, different cultures have different ideas of what a win even looks like. What's considered a great individual achievement in one company might be seen as, not being a team player in another.
And he talks about being aware of your reputation coming in. People will have preconceived notions, and it's up to you to decide if you want to play into those expectations or try to reshape them.
Right. It's about understanding that confirmation bias, where people tend to look for information that confirms their existing beliefs. So you need to be really deliberate in how you present yourself, those early actions and communications. He gives some really good advice on establishing authority in a new role. It's about finding that balance between being assertive and being consultative, focusing on the bigger picture, being decisive when you have enough information, but also knowing when to step back and learn from others. And that genuine commitment to learning, that goes a long way in building your credibility.
So how do you figure out where to focus your efforts to actually secure those early wins?
The key is to find areas where even small improvements can have a big operational or financial impact. You got to be selective, focus on a few key things to avoid spreading yourself too thin.
And he provides that early wins evaluation tool to help with this, right?
Yep. It's a framework for assessing different potential initiatives based on a few factors, like how much potential is there for improvement? Is it achievable with the resources you have? Does it align with the overall strategy and your boss's goals? And maybe most importantly, will achieving this win also help drive those necessary behavioral changes? It's basically a way to score different ideas and see what has the most potential.
That's a great way to prioritize your efforts. And for actually planning and executing those high-impact projects, he outlines that FOGLAMP checklist.
Ah, yes, FOGLAMP. It stands for focus, oversight, goals, leadership, abilities, means, and process. Basically, it's a checklist to make sure you've thought through all the crucial elements. Clearly defining the project, making sure there's accountability, setting measurable goals, identifying the right leader for the project, making sure the team has the skills and resources, and having a clear process in place. It helps ensure your early win projects are set up for success.
And he talks about different approaches to achieving those wins, right? Like pure planning versus a more collective learning style.
Yeah, that's a really important distinction. Sometimes you can just leverage your existing knowledge, create a plan, and execute it, that top-down approach. That can be really effective in certain situations, like turnarounds, where the problems are clear-cut and you need fast action. But other times, like in a realignment where you need to build consensus and get buy-in, that collective learning approach is more effective. That's where you involve people in the process of identifying problems and developing solutions.
So it's about understanding what parts of the change need that direct top-down approach and what parts require more collaboration, that slower, more inclusive style.
Exactly. And he also emphasizes the importance of finding and leveraging the good stuff in the existing culture. Don't throw the baby out with the bathwater, right?
And lastly, he warns about those predictable surprises, those problems that pop up because you've overlooked something or because you haven't really integrated information from different parts of the organization.
Oh, those blind spots can really trip you up. He provides some questions you can ask yourself to uncover those potential issues proactively, both in the external environment, with your customers and competitors, and also within your own internal operations. It's a good reminder to look beyond your immediate area and actively seek out those potential problems before they become real crises.
So just to recap for everyone, navigating those first 90 days really comes down to accelerating your learning in a smart way, taking the time to understand the specific situation you're facing, using a framework like STARS, and then really focusing on securing those early wins to build your credibility and generate some positive momentum. It's a really powerful blueprint for anyone stepping into a new leadership position or facing a major career change.
And that brings us to our final thought for you. Think about the transition you're in right now, or maybe one you're anticipating. Based on what we've discussed today, what's one action you can take, maybe even today, to either boost your learning, fine-tune your understanding of the situation, or identify a potential early win that you could go after?
This whole thing is a continuous process, learning and adapting. We really encourage you to keep coming back to these principles as you move through your career.
Yeah.
Leadership transitions, they're constantly evolving, and that ability to adapt is going to be critical to your success.
And if anything we talked about today really sparked your interest, dive deeper into it. And we'd love to hear from you. Share your own experiences, insights, and questions about your transitions. Remember, this journey of leadership development, it's ongoing.
Keep learning, keep growing, and we'll see you next time on The Deep Dive.
See you then.
For more videos, don't forget to subscribe and like the videos.